So that's my title. Where the title comes from. So it's an obituary of David Kendall by one of his students, Sir John Kingman, who Kingman is over there in the list of presidents. That quotation reflects Kendall's position as pretty much the father of British probability theory, and so that's given me the global conflict phrase in my title. I'll talk about Kendall briefly, but mostly what I'll say is inspired by the next quotation. It comes from a survey written 30 years ago by George Barnard and Robin Plackett. Barnard is one of the presidents over there. Plackett, I think, only ever became vice president. But they were talking about some of the things that Eileen has remarked upon. They were talking really about their generation. So 30 years ago, Plackett and Barnard were probably in their 60s. So they were talking about the generation of the Second World War. Plackett and Barnard's article is actually really a grand survey. So the things that Eileen has mentioned, the revolution really in public economic statistics that was associated with Churchill and Lindemann, Plackett and Barnard talk about that. They talk about the medical statistics. They talk about the whole range of things. And one of the conclusions they reach, summarizing, there's a large increase in the number of people interested in statistics, and they'd got a training free of charge. And the people I'm going to talk about are actually people like Barnard and Plackett. They're not the economic statistics, they're not the economists who went to work for Churchill's statistical office. They're people who were mathematicians and who in fact became the leaders of post-war British mathematical statistics. So my people are like those guys, they're mathematicians. So it's a very small part of the total panorama. But it's about, if you like, it's about education. So in terms of the two questions, what did statistics do for the war and what did the war do for statistics? I'm really interested in the second question, what the war did for statistics, and what it did was produce a lot of statisticians. I'm going to begin, though, by glancing at the First World War, and that's worth doing, partly because it's so different, and also partly because already in the First World War, there was a small number of mathematical statisticians. In the Second World, at the beginning, in 1939, there were more, but in 1914, there were some mathematical statisticians. So it's interesting to look at what happened to them in the war, and also it's interesting to look at the war because the regime, the sort of political regime governing matters like conscription, the use of manpower, were completely different at the beginning of the Second World War, and they were partly inspired by what happened in the First World War and what was seen to be wrong with the system. In retrospect, these are just some generalizations. Scientists actually made a contribution to the First World War. Scientists in general made a contribution to the First World War. They made weapons more effective, basically. There's a whole literature now, some really excellent recent articles on the First World War, marking the centenary of 1914. Reading these things, you see amazing improvisation, amazing use of networks of contacts. So, a spectacular example of this was one of the scientific groups wanted to keep hold of a really smart physicist. He was actually in the army. He was in the Navy. Okay, so what happened was a contact who happened to go to Cambridge with the First Sea Lord, who's the head of the Admiralty. He contacts the First Sea Lord and says, we need this man. We don't want him transferred to something else in the Navy. We want him working in our unit. And that was achieved. So networks are extremely important. The system, I think, at the end of the war was regarded as a system which really just wasted manpower, scientific manpower, and that would be different in the Second World War. So at the beginning of the First World War, huge wave of volunteering. So universities essentially emptied in the First World War. They emptied because everybody joined up. Well, not everybody, but huge numbers of people joined up, and you'll see in some of the figures later. And in particular, nobody expected the war to last very long, so nobody actually worried about students. So students were important in the Second World War because if they were science students or medical students, they had a protected status. They didn't in the First World War. So statistics did little for the war. And the war did little for statistics, and actually statistics did very little for the war. This guy, A.V. Hill, was improvisation connections personified. There's a picture of him before the war. He was a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He was a physiologist. He was extremely smart man. He was also a member of the Officers' Training Corps. In 1914, about a quarter of Cambridge students were members of the Officers' Training Corps. I mean, the Officers' Training Corps was really big. Anyway, so in 1914, he becomes an infantry officer, because that's what the Officers' Training Corps prepared him to be. And then saying that was just the common experience. So here's this bloke, he's a physiologist, and he goes into the army straight away. But anyway, by a sort of fluke, in 1916, he's transferred to the Ministry of Munitions, which was responsible for the factories that produced munitions, and he was asked to assemble a team to work on anti-aircraft defence. So he assembled this team that included physicists, mathematicians, and they worked on anti-aircraft guns. Through contacts, he recruited Carl Pearson. Now, Carl Pearson's computers were the people who did the computations. Carl Pearson had a lab with calculating machines, and he had people who knew how to use them. And he contacted Carl Pearson. Now, in 1916, or in 1900, come to that, or come to that 1925. If you wanted to learn mathematical statistics in Britain, the only place to go was to Carl Pearson's department. And so it really was the centre for mathematical statistics in Britain at the time. However, what Hill wanted Pearson to work on was nothing to do with statistics. He wanted him to do calculations for ballistics. Carl Pearson had a past. He'd been an applied mathematician, and he'd only, in fact, lately transferred from being professor of applied maths at UCL to being professor of eugenics, even though he'd been doing, had as his main occupation biometrics for probably 20 years by then. Okay, so why did he do it? Well, one reason why he did it was he wanted to contribute to the war effort, and before he became involved in ballistics, he was doing bits and pieces for the government to contribute. So he wanted to contribute. He was also leaving staff. He also had staff leaving, so his people were leaving. In the first place, they were leaving because they were volunteering. Later, they were leaving because they were conscripted. So the First World War began with volunteers, and it ended, or from 1916, with conscripts. One of the most spectacular departure was this man Herbert Soper. Soper was probably the best person in Pearson's group, and aged 50, he goes into the army he doesn't go into the army just to fight because he's too old. He goes into the army. The Labour Corps they were basically people who dug. And in the Second World War, they were called the Pioneer Corps. And so this man, Soper, who was probably the most talented of Pearson's group, leaves to go into the army. Now, Pearson wanted to preserve his team, rebuild it if he could. He spent the whole year, 1917, working on ballistics. So his people did calculations for ballistics, and there was a whole network of ballistic calculators. At its peak, the lab had 20 people, so the lab, he had more people. Okay, what he wanted to do was he wanted to get good people working for him and keep them. Well, one person he wanted to keep was a man called Doodson, who became distinguished oceanographer, I guess. So he was a very good person. Anyway, Doodson had an offer from KP, Carl Pearson, to stay after the war, and he had an offer from his teacher, Joseph Proudman, to work on tidal prediction. He took Tideman's offer. He took Proudman's offer. Anyway, he actually explains why. This was to his wife, I think, this letter. KP was 60 at the time. He's old, his chief work is done. Proudman's young, still has much to do, far to go. Pearson makes enemies. He's also very bad-tempered. I don't really want to work with him. He's too domineering. And actually, Pearson was, and he lost lots of people. Okay, so that was this guy became an FRS. So he was somebody Pearson wanted to keep, but he didn't keep. One person he did keep was a man called Oscar Irwin, who appears there as a president of the society in the 1960s. The picture, of course, is not the young man of 1917. It's the man of 1963 or whenever he was president. Now, he was unfit for military service. Quite a few of the distinguished post-war statisticians were unfit. So they wanted to join, but couldn't. I mean, the most famous example is Ronald Fisher, who was almost blind, but very determined to go to war. Okay, so Irwin, who works with KP between school and Cambridge, if he hadn't been unfit, he would have gone to the army, because he wasn't doing work of national importance, because he was just a kid. Anyway, he goes to Cambridge, he gets a first, he's a Cambridge Wrangler, joins Pearson after the war, works with Fisher at Rothamsted, and then works at the School of Hygiene in a Medical Research Council unit, 1931. So that's the only one. Pearson's old students, well, two of them are both presidents of the society. Major Greenwood. Greenwood, in some sense, had the best war, because he actually continued to do research. He was a medical statistician. The research he did was motivated by the Ministry of Munitions wanting to raise productivity in its factories. The questions it asked is, well, why are people so ill? Why do they have so many accidents? So in his work in the Ministry of Munitions, he actually did continuation of his pre-war research. I think Ethel Newbold, who's remembered in the society, there's a prize or a medal for promising female statistician. I think she actually is the only entrant. She and Irwin are the only entrants in statistics through the war. So I think Greenwood had, in some sense, a good war, professionally speaking. Yule, I think, had a pretty ropey war, because he just had 4 years doing things he didn't want to do. And one of his friends, Maurice Kendall, said he never spoke to me of those years with any affection. But he did some joint work with Greenwood on accidents, accident proneness, and so on. So that was the First World War. So basically, the First World War for statistics really didn't progress statistics. It's probably 4 wasted years. The statisticians all found useful work, but apart from Greenwood, they didn't find useful work as statisticians. Okay, so moving on, a few more. In the interwar years, well, Pearson's empire by the late 30s had been divided, and there were 3 mini empires at UCL. Ronald Fisher at the Galton Lab, he was the professor of eugenics. Egon Pearson, Pearson's son, was became professor of statistics, and J.B.S. Haldane became professor of biometry. So there's a bit of expansion at UCL. School of Hygiene, well, Greenwood and Irwin were there. Rothamsted, Fisher had left, Yates had taken over. Shirley Institute was a cotton research institute. The presidential name there is Tippett. He was associated with that. There's a Wool Industries Research Institute. I don't know if Daniels is a president. And Cambridge Maths. I want to concentrate on Cambridge Maths because later on there'll be the people I'm talking about. What happened in Cambridge? Well, Yule, who'd been an earliest student of Pearson, he retired in 1931. Wishart, who came, Wishart taught maths students as well as agricultural students. Maurice Bartlett came in 1938. He actually was a serious mathematician. He'd actually been a Cambridge graduate. He'd actually been a student of Wishart's a few years before. He'd got quite a good CV. He'd only been away from Cambridge for a few years, but he'd been in Egon Pearson's department, and he'd also worked at an ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries research establishment. There are a couple of people who taught things which were sort of statistics, but sort of not. The astronomer Arthur Eddington taught on the theory of errors, and the geophysicist Harold Jeffreys taught on probability. I think in Cambridge there were 2 sorts of students, and they're illustrated by these quotations. These are people talking about Wishart's lectures. Kempthorne liked them. He's fed up doing pure maths. Barnard hated them. He decided it wasn't for me. This was hopeless. He, in fact, wanted to become a mathematical logician. So I think pure mathematicians thought Wishart's work was uninteresting. A certain kind of mathematician found them interesting. So, diverted careers. I'll talk about 3 people who ended up where you might think they ended up. These were, if you like, people interested in stats. C.A.B. Smith ended up in UCL biometrics in 1945. That's what he's interested in. That's a good destination. A guy called Frank Anscombe ended up in Rothamsted, the Agricultural Research Institute. So did Kempthorne in 1941. Sorry, I've gone over. Smith, well, he basically did research under Bartlett, Wishart, Irwin, got a PhD. He was a conscientious objector. In 1914, he would have gone to jail. But in 1942, they were more enlightened. He didn't go to the army. He was a porter in a hospital. Adam Brooks must have had the most impressive array of porters in any hospital in the universe. They had so many clever people. Conscientious objection wasn't... he's the only person I've noticed, the only, if you like, celebrity who actually was a conscientious objector. It's a much bigger issue in the First World War. Kempthorne, he got a distinction, but instead of doing a peacetime job, he went to a bit of the Ministry of Supply on tank production. I guess Eileen's tank factory pictures would suit him. But he went to Rothamsted in 1941. Because food was important, especially food was important in wartime because Britain would have to produce so much more. Rothamsted was actually an important place. He didn't want to run it down. Anscombe was a research student of Bartlett's. When Bartlett went to this place called PDE, I'll mention. He went with him. But then Bartlett moved, then Anscombe moved off to this other group, SR17, that I'll talk about. So, echoes of 1914. And 1939 had a new system, but there's loads of echoes of 1914, like this wonderful conversation that the undergraduate has with a maths lecturer who's wearing a sergeant's uniform. And undergraduate, I've done use for maths in the army. And the sergeant, who's a lecturer in maths, said, no, there isn't, actually. Services have taken 3 professional mathematicians from Cambridge, one for the army to tell them about underwater explosions, one for the Air Force to explain stellar navigation, and me, and my job is just to count the number of people who go to these various destinations. And Hammersley added, I expect he was a number theorist. Another echo of 1914. In 1914, Edmund Cecil Rhodes, who was a Cambridge first, he became an instructor lieutenant. So he had a good career in statistics after the war. In 1939, lots of people considered doing this because there was an advert in the Times, so they all apply. David Kendall saw the form. The form had big spaces for sporting achievement, nothing really for academic competence, even though your job as an instructor lieutenant in the Navy was to teach maths. But, so he's obviously not the right kind of staff. These guys, Kendall, Barnard, are brilliant storytellers, so these are good stories. Barnard actually got as far as an interview. Barnard was this bloke who wanted to be a mathematical logician. He'd sailed off to Princeton to learn how to do mathematical logic and just happened to be back home when the war began. Anyway, he applied for the job. All his friends from Cambridge applied for the job. At the interview, the officer explained the job was to teach junior officers basic maths, but actually your real job is to be in the officers' mess and advise people on probabilities involved in betting. So this could be from 1914. This isn't system at all. Another echo of the First World War. This is Egon Pearson. Egon Pearson, in a sense, inherited his father's department. He had similar motives to his father. He wanted to keep the group together. But actually, instead of taking in work, the department left work, and UCL, being in central London, was dispersed all over the country, and his choice was to take his department and just make it a branch of the civil service. So he went off to another ballistics thing. A.V. Hill, the guy who we saw earlier, who recruited his father, facilitated the move, so on. People in the department included, these departments were tiny. These 4 names were the department. They all became names in statistics. F.N. David is Florence Nightingale David. Her parents knew Florence Nightingale, apparently. In the course of the war, some of these people moved jobs. These people have no role, even though this was probably the biggest centre for training statisticians in 1939. These people didn't recruit any new people, so in some sense they play no role in doing things. In 1940, rockets and probability, that involves 2 people, Maurice Bartlett, who was the Cambridge lecturer, and David Kendall. David Kendall had got a first at Oxford 1939, undecided between astronomy or analysis, but then he went to the projectile development establishment. Bartlett went there, Kendall went there, Anscombe, who was Bartlett's PhD student, went there, and the job was to work on anti-aircraft rockets. And while there, Bartlett developed an interest in stochastic processes, which wasn't part of the stats scene before the war. Kendall developed an interest in probability in stochastic processes, so that's the great change that in his life. Planning for war. Okay, 1939 things were different, but basically since the early 30s, the government had worried about rearmament. They're worried about how to organise things. So there was conscription from the beginning. There was a list of reserved occupations. This included university teachers. So what happened in the First World War was somebody like Eddington, who was an astronomer, he was a Quaker. He didn't go to the army, or he didn't go to jail, he didn't go, he was doing work of national importance. But he had to appear in front of people who said, you're a coward, you should be doing your bit. That didn't happen in the Second World War because if you're a university professor or a university lecturer, you weren't called up. Shorter degrees, so did a degree in 2 years instead of 3 years. Deferment of national service for medical and science students. Tough if you're doing history or English, but not so tough if you're doing maths. And there was a committee to assign completing students to war duties. So this wasn't somebody who was. It's included a university figure. Hill, who's now older, he's come up every ladder inside. He's come up the academic ladder, so he's a Royal Society professor. He's got a Nobel Prize. He's also involved in advising the government on air defence. He's also risen in the Royal Society. He's secretary of the Royal Society, or one of the two secretaries, and he initiates a register of scientific personnel. One of the reasons why he did that is it's just efficient to know where the skills are, but another reason seemed to be a personal reason. He'd been a lieutenant in the infantry in the First World War when he went and did scientific work in the ministry. And he said that, this was, I was aware there were tasks I could undertake which were actually more essential than being an infantry officer. But that wasn't the sort of thing you talked about when other chaps were being killed. So I think there was a reason why Hill and other people wanted this system. Okay, what happened in Cambridge? In the first column, Cambridge maths collapsed. The university collapsed, really. Hardly anybody was, in 1918, hardly anybody was doing maths. 16 against 150. Students went off to the war, the lecturers went off, everyone went off to the war. 1939, the numbers fell in the years, but partly they fell because there was a shorter degree, and so the Part 1 numbers hold up. Part 2 shrinks actually quite a bit, from 60 to 21. From 39 to 43. Part 3 virtually disappears. That's the last year because of the shorter degree. But basically, the Cambridge remained in business. Okay, what happened? What were these people taught in these short degrees? Well, they weren't taught by Wishart or Bartlett anymore because they went off. Jeffreys and Eddington stayed. And there was an entrant who was Irwin, who was Oscar Irwin from the First World War. He worked for the School of Hygiene, or he was based at the School of Hygiene, but that bit was sent to Cambridge because they evacuated these central London things. So he was the teacher of statistics. Student reviews of these lectures. James Durbin, thought of Irwin's lectures not very intellectually, very exciting. David Cox, wasn't terribly inspiring. Cox on Jeffreys, intriguing but almost totally incomprehensible. Everybody found that about Jeffreys' lectures. It wasn't the material that was incomprehensible. It was that Jeffreys just was inarticulate, and so he would just and all the stories were how people just evacuated his lectures, the audiences just shrank and so on. So, although in retrospect Jeffreys was a great man, nobody learned anything from him. The committee, so you've done the course, the committee. Durbin says to the committee, I don't want to do statistical work. But anyway, they put him in an operations research group anyway. Lindley much preferred the civil service to the armed forces, and he got his way, he went to the armed forces. Bailey was offered the choice, do you want to do statistics or electronics? he didn't want to do statistics. He wanted to do electronics, but it turned out that involved statistical work, and he, after the war, became one of these statisticians. There were, of course, people who I haven't mentioned who actually went to the army. So some people wanted to go to the army and they had their way, unlike Durbin, who seems to have wanted to go. Durbin was the distinguished statistician who became an academic because the long summer holidays meant he had time for mountaineering. And, so there's no accounting for taste. In 1942-43, a surprisingly large number of people completing Part 2 went to a single destination. This is this place, this unit called SR17. In 1942, there were 18 Wranglers, as Cambridge jargon for first class students. 3 of them, those 3, went to SR17. In 1943, 3 of the 16 firsts went to SR17, and 5 of the upper seconds, of the 5 upper seconds, 2 went to SR17. So this group swallowed a huge number, a huge proportion of the Cambridge high performers in maths. The Ministry of Supply, SR17 was the code name for the Ministry of Supply's Advisory Service on Quality Control. That's one of their publications. Established in 1942, interactions between the civil servant and a Cambridge fellow who specialised in analysis. Responded to American influence. The details of the stories vary, but it seems basically the word was from the Americans that you should do quality control. And, well, they did. Ironically, the only person in Britain who made a speciality of quality control was the distinguished Egon Pearson, son of Carl, president. He wasn't involved in this because his group had already gone off to do some other war work. The people involved, well, this guy, Frank Smithers, is an important person in history of maths in Britain. Cambridge mathematician. He was at the Ministry of Supply. That was the new Ministry of Munitions. And he interacted with a guy called Womersley. Womersley was a scientific civil servant who worked with Tippett, one of the Cotton research guy. And then he moved to the government unit on ballistics at Woolwich Arsenal. He then became important in the Ministry of Supply. And then he recruits people. The people he recruits are a funny bunch because they actually don't know an awful lot. The most prominent person is George Barnard. He's the person who really didn't want to do statistics. He'd gone to Princeton to do mathematical logic. There he became friends with Smithers, and contact with Smithers got him into SR17. Other people, well, I say Barnard didn't have much knowledge. A guy called Edward Van Rest had worked on forestry stats. Anscombe, who'd been Bartlett's PhD student, was involved. In answer to the question, what did you do in the war, Dennis Lindley, who was one of this group, said, well, we did some nice things. They were based in central London, near the National Gallery. There were concerts at midday. You could do the Times crossword puzzle. Actually, it's like being a group of PhD students without a supervisor. There was practical work done, but obviously wasn't done by Lindley. I mean, there were people in this group who went out to factories and told them how to do quality control, but that's not the picture that Lindley presents. We were just learning stats. We read all the big papers. I mean, just like PhD students. But there are a lot of them doing this kind of work. They also publish things in journals. Here's the group. There they are. This is SR17, 25 years on, so everybody's 25 years older. The guy sitting down in the middle, he's Edward Van Rest. The guy behind him, standing with glasses, that's Dennis Lindley without the beard. That's, the picture that Eileen showed you was a bearded Dennis Lindley. So Dennis Lindley's there. Armitage is over in the back corner. Plackett is there, and there's a whole load of people there. the group. I mean, and then there's another picture. Barnard's the bloke to the left of the woman seated. So these people had some sense of identity. A complete transformation. Well, complete. Egon Pearson was the only professor of stats in 1939. Other people like Fisher, he was a professor of eugenics. So there were people in professorial positions who were statisticians, but anyway, Pearson was the only prof of stats. He says it's interesting to know that a number of these SR17 people who've been taught by Irwin at Cambridge now hold statistical chairs in this country. I just looked those up quickly. There are more. So basically what happened was these people, as far as I can see, pretty much all of the people who were in SR17 continued in statistics. These guys obviously continued into academic roles. Some of them became official statisticians, but they typically stayed. I mean, they're basically people who were recruited when they were 21. They were taught something. The something is interesting. They had jobs and they went for it. So in the 60s onwards, these people are professors. Looking back to, I didn't write a slide about this because I only thought about it on the train. Looking back, SR17, which only existed for a year or two, actually did everything that Carl Pearson in 1916-17 would have hoped for. It generated all these people. It's a completely ephemeral organisation, and it just disappeared after the war, but it really did the business in terms of training people. So that's a view from 1973. However, it wasn't a straight line from 1945 to 1960. David Cox, as Irwin said, wasn't one of this group. He went to the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Anyway, so this is Cox reflecting as late as 50. So Cox is, common assent, I guess, the biggest figure of this generation. Anyway, so here's the great man says, well, as late as 1955, I would have considered giving up stats because there were no jobs. So although there were jobs in the 60s and onwards, there were very few jobs. There were very few jobs in the 50s. So some jobs were created after the war, and then nothing very much happened. But then they were created after the war. So that's really the end. Well, it is the end. So thank you.